Today's daf is daf Pei Gimel, and we begin with Toshma, which is 5 lines down from the top. We're trying to figure out the Shita of Sumchus. Sumchus says that if you violate two prohibitions with one act, even if you get one hasra for those two prohibitions, you get 80 malchus. And the Gemara wants to know whether that only applies to the case of Oso Ves Beno, which is the case of Gufim Mechulakim, because we're talking about two live animals that he's not allowed to shech both of them. Or does Sumchus have a general rule that applies to any two averos, even if it would be guf echad, that you can incur two sets of malchus, a double series of malchus, 80 malchus, for violating the avera twice with one asra? Toshma, we have a brisa that says, Ochal shnei gidim mishtei yerechos b'shtei behemos sofek shmonim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer eno sofek ela arbaim. So we're talking about a person who eats gid anosha from two different animals, taken from the thigh of animal A and from the thigh of animal B. And since he did two different averos, like the case in Nazir where he drank wine, they gave him asra and he drank more wine, he should therefore be chayev shmonim, and that's the shita of the Tanakam. However, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says no, he only violates one avera, he only gets one punishment for eating one gid anosh. Hechidami, what's the case? If we're talking about a case where you got one asra, don't eat the sciatic nerve of this animal, he ate it, and then they gave him a second asra, and once again he ate the sciatic nerve from a second animal, then my time at Rabbi Yehuda Diomar Aboyim, how could it possibly be that according to Rabbi Yehuda you only get Vesulo, you don't get more than 40 malchus? That should be similar to the case of a Nazir, which we saw everybody agrees that if you gave him one asra against drinking wine, and he went ahead and he drank wine and violated asra, then he got a second asra, don't drink wine, and he violated and drank wine a second time, he's chayev twice. He gets malchus for each shtia of yain, because they were separate hasros. So therefore, if we're talking about a case where he ate two gid anoshes with two different asros, and he violated each hasra separately, then for sure Rabbi Yehuda would have to agree that he gets 80 malchus. Elapshita, we have no choice but to assume that b'vas achas ubechad asra, that we're talking about a case where he didn't eat one gid anosha after following one asra and a second gid anosha after following a second asra, but rather he got one asra and he immediately ate the gid anosha from animal A and from animal B. And man Tanakama, now we have to analyze who is the one who would say that in one asra, with one continuous achila, he gets two sets of malchus, 80 malchus all told. It can't be Rabbanon, ilema Rabbanon, de pligele de sumchus. And again, we go through a kalvachomer, which we had over and over again yesterday, uma chosam, in the case of Oso Ves Beno, where there were two live animals, and gufin mechulakim, and yet patri rabbanan, the rabbanan say you can't violate and be chayiv twice for one action when there was one asra, one action, is then hacha here in the case of gid anosha, which is not gufin mechulakim, but rather it's called guf echad lo kolshken. How much more so will the rabbanan say that he only incurs one set of malchus, 40 malchus? It can't be that the 80 malchus here in the Tanakama should be related to the Rabbanan of Sumchus, because Rabbanan of Sumchus, even in the case of Gufim Mechulakim, say that he only gets one set of malchus. How much more so in the case where it's Guf Echad? Now, just on the side, you might ask, why is this Guf Echad? After all, there's a sciatic nerve from one animal, animal A, and another sciatic nerve from animal B, and therefore you have two different gufim. Why does Gemara assume that this is guf echad? But the answer is, we're talking after shchita. We're talking about after the animal is dead. Once the animal is dead, then it makes no difference whether it came from this animal or that animal. There's no din of gufim mechulakim unless you're dealing with a live animal. So when you're dealing with Oso Ves Beno and you're talking about the shchita, the animal's alive, the prohibition of the shchita is now a prohibition of gufim mechulakim. right? We said, for example, if he shechted the mother and now he has two offspring, then each offspring is a separate entity. And the Torah says, don't shech this offspring, don't shech this offspring. Each one is a violation of Oso Vespino. And therefore you have Gufim Mechulakim of two live animals, because you're talking about the shechita while the animal is alive. But if you're talking about Gid Anosha could only be feasible after the animal is dead, and therefore it's called Guf Echad. El Alav, by process of elimination, who could possibly be the author of the Brisa, meaning the Tanakam of the Brisa? It's got to be Sumchus. And here we see in a case of Guf Echad that Sumchus nevertheless says Yechayev Shmonim, you get two sets of Malchus, because included in this Hasra is a Hasra against eating, number one, the Gid Anosha of animal A, and two, included in that Hasra was don't eat the Gid Anosha of animal B. And now he went ahead and he ate in one simultaneous violation both the Gid Anosha of A and the Gid Anosha of B. He in effect has violated the Isra Achilas Gid Anosha twice, and therefore each one separately will generate a Chiv Malchus. So now we have a final answer to our question as to how far Sumchus's principle of Chaim Shtayim would go. Does it apply even in a case of Guf Echad? And the Gemara says no. Let's go back to our original understanding. Li'olam bazeh achar zeh. Now, we rejected bazeh achar zeh, meaning if he had asra, don't eat the Gid Anosha of animal A. And then after eating animal A, he had asra, and he violated the second asra of eating Gid Anosha of animal B. And we rejected it because how could Rabbi Yehuda possibly argue that he only gets one set of malchus? After all, it's like the case of a Nazir where every Hasra generates its own set of Malchus. And the Gemara now introduces an Ukimta. Kigon, what's the case? Deles Be Kizayis. There is one Gid Anosha, let's say of animal A, that the sinew itself reaches the volume of an olive size, but the Gid Anosha of animal B does not reach the volume of a kizayis. Rabbi Yehuda says that every Gid Anosha to violate the achila and generate malchus has to have a kizayis. So if the sinew of an animal happens to be less than a kizayis, you cannot generate malchus for eating that less than the shear of kizayis. And therefore, in this case, where only one of the two gidim of one of the two animals has, in fact, the volume of kizayis, he can only be chayev malchus for that Gid Anosha that has a kizayis, but not for the other one. Now, what do the Rabbanan hold? The Rabbanan say that you get two sets of malchus. Why? So here we have to introduce a concept called a birya. A birya means that which exists in nature, like, for example, an ant. Let's say, chas v'shalom, you swallow an ant, and if you do it deliberately, you chayv malchus, even though the ant is less than a kizayis, but it's called a birya. And here, too, the Gid Anosha is called a birya, according to the Chachamim of Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore, despite the fact that that Gid Anosha has less than a kizayis in volume, nevertheless, it's a birya, and birya has chashivus that obviates the need for a kizayis. Now, you might ask me the following question. Well, why is Gid Anosha birya? It's only part of a larger organism. But the answer is that the Chachamim, disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda, hold that any part of the organism, if it's complete in its natural state, is a birya. So the Gid Anosha is a gid which is a birya. And if it happens to be that in this animal, the Gid Anosha is less than the volume size of an olive, nevertheless it's a birya, and that replaces the requirement of a kizayis. According to Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, no. The Sanya, we went to the Brisa. Achlo v'einbo kizayis. He eats the entire Gid Anosha, but there's no kizayis. It's a case of an animal that has a small Gid Anosha. Chayev. According to Tanakama, he's chayev because he ate a birya, and it doesn't have to have a kizayis. But Rabbi Yehuda omer ad shebo kizayis, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that the law of birya only applies to a complete organism, but not to a limb or sinews or parts of an organism. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the upper half of Daf Pei Gimel. Bi'arba prokim bashona hamocher behema lechaver tzarich lo'odia. We're talking about a case where a mocher is selling two animals to two different people on the same day. To one, he sells the mother, presumably for the purpose of shechita. That's why the buyer buys the animal. And to the other one, he sells the offspring. And now the question is, does the ball fall into the court of the mocher to obligate him to notify the second buyer, hey, you should know you cannot shecht your purchase on this day, because if you don't wait till tomorrow, you'll violate the Isur of Osa Espino, because I already sold its mother to another person. And that person who bought the mother presumably will immediately shecht the animal. So that by the time you get to shecht your animal, you'll be violating Oso Vespino. And this is based on the sugi that we learned yesterday, that Oso Vespino will apply even in two gavri, right? It says Lotishkatu in plural. There's one person who shechts it and another person who shechts it. One person shechts the mother, the other shechts the offspring. It doesn't matter which and which. So now the Mishnah establishes that the whole year round, the mocher doesn't have to assume that the shechita on the part of the lokech, the buyer, will take place immediately. There was no stipulation and no explicit statement on the part of the buyer that I'm going to shecht this immediately. So if I sell the mother to so-and-so, and that so-and-so indicates that he's going to shecht it today or immediately, then when I sell its offspring to another person, almoni, then I have to notify him. But that's not the assumption the whole year round. The whole year round, we could assume that the buyer will keep the animal for as long as he has to, and maybe he'll work with the animal and thresh with the animal, and then at some point he's going to shecht it. So there's no obligation incumbent upon the seller to notify the buyer of the second animal, hey, you should know I sold its mother today. But on 4 occasions during the Hebrew calendar year, the mocher is obligated to notify the lokeach, hey, we're talking about the second lokeach, I already sold its mother today. And therefore, I'm warning you that you have to understand the terms of the agreement of this purchase are such that you will not be able to shecht it today, because you have to assume that the mother was shechted today, and therefore you'll have to buy it on the condition that tomorrow you will shecht it, but not today. And the halacha is that if the mocher fails to notify the lokeach on these 4 special days of the year, then the lokeach could say mekachtos. This is an erroneous sale under false pretenses. I had no reason to assume that you had sold the mother today. Now, what's unique about these 4 days in the Hebrew calendar year? These are days in which the premise is, even if the lokeach didn't say a word, we assume that he bought it to shecht it immediately, because these are periods in which the buyer is purchasing an animal in order to shecht it for a seuda, for a special, unique meal, like Henry VIII kind of meal. And why is it? Because these 4 days of the Hebrew calendar year are days in which we eat festive meals. What are these days? We'll see in just a minute what these days are. But in any event, the assumption is that since the buyer is buying it for the Suda of that day, of that evening, let's say, therefore he's going to shecht it immediately. And therefore the mocher becomes responsible, the ball's in his court, to notify lokech, who bought the second animal, hey, you should know I sold its mother today. And tzarich lodio ima macharti lishchad. I sold its mother under the assumption that it would be shechted, the mother would be shechted immediately on this day. And bita macharti lishchot, or let's say the opposite, because we said yesterday in the sugya on Pei Beis that it doesn't matter what sequence, whether you shech the mother first and then the bas, or the other way around. So if the mocher already sold the calf, the bas, earlier today, he has to notify the buyer of the cow, of the mother, that you should know I sold its offspring earlier today, and therefore you have to understand that the conditions are such in this sale that contractually you can't claim erroneous mekachtos because you thought you could check it today. I'm telling you up front, Don't shecht it today. You'll violate the Isser of Osov Espino. Now, just 1 minute before we get on to the specific enumerated list of these four special days, days of buying animals for the purpose of immediate shechita for the Suda of that evening, let's talk about a case in which on these 4 days in the Hebrew calendar year, the mocher, um, what's the word I'm looking for? The mocher was negligent, and he did not notify the lokeach, the second buyer, that he had indeed sold either its mother or its bas earlier that day. What happens then? So in that case, even though the lokeach didn't say a word to the mocher that he's buying it in order to shecht today, immediately. Nevertheless, the premise is that he bought it for shechita today. That's the chiddush of these four occasions, that the purchase of the animal was for the purpose of immediate shechita. And since the mocher failed to live up to his part of the bargain and notify the lokeach that under these circumstances, I'm selling it to you, know well that you will not be able to shech the animal today. And since we assume that the buyer bought it specifically to shecht it immediately, therefore it's a mekach tos, which means that the lokeach could say, take your animal back and give me my money back. Eluhain, these are the four unique days where the assumption is that the buyer purchased it for immediate shechita. Number one, Erev Yontif Achron Shel Chag. This is fascinating, especially in the light of recent history. Achron Shel Chag is Shmini Atzeres. Now Rashi points out that Shmini Atzeres is a regel b'fnei atzmo, and the culmination of Sukkos is Shmini Atzeres as a separate regel. Now it could be that on Erev Sukkos, even though the night of Sukkos we certainly have a special unique meal, a festive meal in the Sukkah, but nevertheless, Erev Sukkos he's so busy. He's farnument, as we say, with buying schach and lulavim and putting up the schach in the sukkah. He doesn't have a festive meal on his mind. But what he does in his mind is he postpones it and he says, you know what? The ultimate celebration will be on Shmini Atzeres. I'm going to buy an animal on Erev Shmini Atzeres, which is the seventh day of Sukkot, and the nighttime I will already eat the basar of this beautiful, cow with all the steak, and that's going to be my Shmini Atzeres meal. So therefore, if there's a purchase before Sukkot, even close to Sukkot, there's no assumption on the part of the mocher that he has to assume the lokech is going to shech the meat. But if it's on the seventh day of Sukkot, moving towards Shmini Atzeres, which is a few hours later at night, then the mocher has to assume that the lokeach is buying it for immediate shechita, and therefore if he sells it to a second one, sells the child, he has to notify him. And the second case is Erev Yontif Harishon Shel Pesach. Now, Erev Pesach, before we get to the Seder at night, is you're going to buy an animal and shecht it immediately to prepare for the festive meal. Now, what about the last day of Pesach? Tosfos raises the following question. After all, the last day of Pesach, Shvi Shel Chag, also has the status of a yontif with an Isur Malacha. And maybe if you sell an animal on the Erev of Shvi Shel Pesach, like the Erev of Shmini Shel Sukkos, which means Shmini Atzeres, you as a mocher have to assume that the lokech is buying it for immediate shechita. And here Rashi adds that there's a special status of Shmini Atzeres as a regel b'fnei atzmo, and therefore you buy in order to prepare for a special suda. But Shvi Shel Pesach, with all due respect to Shvi Shel Pesach, we have the Sudas HaMashiach if you're a Chabadnik, and we're going to read Shiras Hayam and so forth and so on. But nevertheless, there's no unique kind of special Suda that we assume he's buying it for immediate Shechita. We go on. For Erev Yontif, Erev Atzeres. And by the way, there's a special mitzvah of eating a beautiful meal on Chag Hashvuos Chag Atzeres, because Hakol Modim B'Shvuos is Be'ina Nami Lechem Shebo Nitne Torah L'Yisrael. The Erev Rosh Hashanah. Now this is fascinating. He's preparing for a Suda of Leil Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Adid. Rosh Hashanah is a day of Pachad and Yira. The scary day. I mean, unless you're an Uman, I don't know. But how could it be that he was preparing to shech this animal immediately on Erev Pesach so it'll have a beautiful Suda Rosh Hashanah? The answer is Kihi mozechem v'chedvaschem. The Torah says, the Tanakh says, that we believe and we rely on Hashem that He will save us and spare us and write us down for a good year on Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, we prepare for a great Suda. Also, the Rishonim add here that there are so many different simanim that we have to eat on Leil, Rosh Hashanah, we beautify the Suda, and therefore he buys a cow in order to shecht it immediately, and that's the assumption, and therefore the mocher has to notify the second locator. Now, u'kedivrei Rav Yossi HaGalili, af Erev Yom HaKippurim beGolil. It seems like in Golil, on Erev Yom Kippur, they had a tremendously festive meal, and they would buy cows and meat and bulls and so forth and so on in order to shecht it and eat the meat on Erev Yom HaKippurim. There's a special mitzvah of Achila on Erev Yom HaKippurim, and in the Golil, the minig was to elevate it to the status of a festive meal, even though I doubt if the mitzvah Achila on Erev Yom Kippur is a Suda. I don't know. Amar Rav Yehuda, Emosai. Bisman she'ein lo revach, aval yesh lo revach, ein tzarich lo dia. Let's say, for example, he doesn't sell both animals on the same day, but he sells one animal on Sunday, another animal on Monday. Ein tzarich lo dia, there's no obligation on the part of the mocher to notify the lokeach, hey, I'm selling you the offspring today on Monday, and you should know that I sold the mother yesterday on Sunday. Because as we said before, during the 4 special days, there we assume that there was an immediate shechita, but in the case of selling one animal on one day and another animal on another day, there's no assumption that the buyer bought it for immediate shechita. However, Mod Rabbi Yehuda, there's one scenario in which even if the cow and the calf, we'll call it, was sold on 2 separate days, the assumption is they'll both be shechted on the same day, and therefore chayiv lo dia. And what is that case? B'moches ha'em lechasan v'es habas lekala. The chasan and the kala and their respective families are both preparing for what's called the Sudas Nesuin. And it was a festive meal that was served after the chuppah on the night of the wedding. And therefore, no matter what day the chassan bought the mother and the kala bought the calf, they're both going to shecht it on the same day, because they're going to shecht it right before the marriage. And therefore, you have to be modia now. The Gemara is going to ask, why did he sell the mother to the chassan and the calf to the kala? Anyway, sheshneim shochtu v'yomecha. V'arba prokim elu mashchitin es hatabach bal korcha. Afilu shava elef dinarim. So what happened here? Ruvain, on one of these 4 special days, gives the mocher a single dinar for a shar that's worth on the market 1,000 dinar. So that means he's buying it on credit, and the 999 balance he will pay at some extra day, some extra time. Because ain't the lokeach a dinar. All the lokeach has in his pocket of liquid assets is only 1 single dinar. So he gave 1 single dinar to purchase a shar that was worth 1,000 dinar. Nevertheless, kofin oso lishchat. The kinyan is valid based on the down payment of 1 dinar, and the assumption is on these 4 special days that the terms of the agreement in this contractual kinyan were such that the mocher will go ahead and shech the animal on behalf of the lokech immediately, so that he could provide the lokeach with the meat, because again, he's preparing for the suda of that lila on those special days. And therefore, the lokeach has a right to say to the tabach, who's also the mocher in this case, you have to provide me for meat. You have to go ahead and shech the animal. Otherwise, the deal is off. Now, once we assume that the mocher has to do the shechita, that's because based on the premise that the transaction is binding. Therefore, lefichach in mace, if something happens, lightning strikes and the animal dies, mace al lokech, the transaction was valid. So we have two nafkaminas here to the fact that the transition on these four occasions is valid, even though he only paid one dinar out of 1,000. Number one, it is the basis for our forcing the tabach mocher to go ahead and shech the animal. Number two, in event that the animal dies through some onus, then it's lokech who has to suffer the consequences. He suffers the loss because the kinyan was binding. However, on the days of the rest of the year, there's no assumption that the buyer is buying under the premise that the mocher tabach will immediately shech the animal. Plenty of time. And therefore, the Mishnah says that paying one dinar for 1,000 dinars worth of a shor is not binding. The kinyan is not chal. And therefore, we cannot compel the mocher, who's also the tabach, to shech the animal. And lefichach emes meis mocher. Now, if the animal dies, then the mocher has not yet transferred ownership over to the lokeach. The lokeach only paid him one dinar. And therefore, he, the mocher, has to suffer the loss in event that the animal drops dead. Tana, we learned in a brisa, in lo hodio holech v'shochet v'eno nimna. So what happens? In a case where, during these 4 special days, the mocher said absolutely nothing to the lokeach, and therefore, the lokech does not have to be inhibited and worry about the possibility that earlier today the mocher sold the mother or the offspring of this animal that he now lokech is buying, the second purchase, because he has rights to assume that in event that the mocher had actually sold the mother or the child earlier this day, he would have certainly have notified. Omar Rabbi Yehuda Masai. Why is it that the chassan purchased the mother cow in the language of the Mishnah and the kala purchased the offspring? The Mishnah, by the by, wants to tell you something on the side. So that the groom's family will go way out in order to prepare the Suda, and therefore the cow has a lot more meat than the calf, and the chassan will buy the cow because the chassan and his entire entourage and his family and his parents and sisters are going to invest much more in the Suda. Now, this has to do with a sugya Masechta Ksubas as to really who is obligated fundamentally in the Suda. We live in a culture where we think like the thrust of the obligations is on the kala, but this Gemara seems to see otherwise. Anyway, the Arba Prokim Elu. So the Gemara asks for Holo Moshach. We have a rule that a kinyan on metaltal and on movable objects is only clinched when there's Mashicha. So even though you bought something by paying for it, you still did not own it until you do a Mashicha on it. Now, presumably, when the mocher sold the shor to the lokeach, although the lokeach put down, let's call it 1 dinar out of 1,000, that's kesef, but we're talking about a shor. A shor is metaltal, and therefore, since the lokeach presumably did not make a mashicha, therefore it's not his. So why did we say that we're going to force the mocher to shecht it and if the animal dies, the lokech suffers as a result of a valid transaction the loss. That's not so. He never did a Mashicha. We have to assume that the Mishnah left out a detail, a condition, that there was Mashicha. If we're talking in the Mishnah case there was Mashicha, then what difference does it make whether it's those 4 special occasions or the whole year round? In both cases, since the Lokech made a Mashicha, therefore, if the animal dies, then the Lokech is going to suffer the consequences. And yet the Mishnah says for the rest of the year, since the Kinyan is not valid, therefore the Mocher is going to suffer the consequence. But if there was Mashicha, then the Kinyan is valid. Omar Rav Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzchak li Olam Shalom Mosh. Let's go back to original assumption. We have to assume that there was no Mashicha. Ukigon shezika lo al yidei acher. So now we enter into a rule in Hilchas Mekach Umemka Hilchas Kinyanim, namely that if Reuven wants to sell something to Shimon, and Shimon's not available to do the Mashicha, he's out in Medina Sayam, then Reuven could say to Levi, a third party, listen, Levi, I want you to do something on behalf of Shimon, and you do the Kinyan. I use this all the time when I have a gift, let's say for a bar mitzvah boy, which I want to give on Shabbos, but you're not supposed to give a gift on Shabbos. So what I do is I'm makne it through a third party on behalf of the bar mitzvah because of the principle called zachin li adam shelo b'fana. Now, if we're talking about arba prokim halalu, then it makes sense that the mocher could say to Levi, to a third party, I want you to stand here and do the kinyan and implement it, the Mashiach, on the part of Shimon who's not around, because it's for the benefit of Shimon, that now Shimon acquires ownership on a cow, and I'll shech the cow on his behalf, and then give him the meat, and by providing him the meat, he'll have meat for the Suda of the night. But what does Shimon gain by acquiring the cow immediately in Shayimos Hashana? He's not in any rush to shecht it. And now if he acquires ownership, if in event that a fire breaks out and the animal dies, then he's going to have to suffer the loss. So therefore, Levi has no halachic legal right to stand as an agent, a self-appointed agent on the part of Shimon, on the part of the buyer, and say, well, I'm doing the Mashiach on your behalf. Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yochanan. And now we have an alternative explanation of our Mishnah. The Arbra Pakum Elu Hamiu Chacham Divrei Al Din Torah, Diam Rabbi Yochanan, etc., etc. Now, we have to understand that Rabbi Yochanan's Shita is, and this appears all over the show, that Midvar Torah Mos Konos, that according to the Torah law, you can acquire ownership on something that's a valid kinyan, a transaction is valid and clinched with Mos. But the Rabbanan made a takana based on the power of Hefker, Bezdin Hefker, not to allow Mos to clinch the kinyan. And we'll see in a minute why they made such a takana. What the Rabbanan did in the case of 4 prakim is they left it on the doraisa. They said, you know what? Mos konos. And therefore, since it's for the benefit of Lokech on these 4 days of the year, that the mekach bichal and the animal be shechted on their behalf, and they'll pick up the meat so that they could prepare adequately for tonight's Suda on these 4 days. Therefore, the Rabbanan said, you know what? We're not going to institute our Gzeira, I'll call it Gzeira, the Gemara calls it Gzeira, but rather we're going to leave the din Doraisa Bimkoma as it is, and the Lokeach, for his benefit, is going to acquire ownership through Mos. Now, why did the Rabbanan do such a thing? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Dvar Torah Mos Konos, Umatam Amar Mashiach Konos. Why did the Rabbanan made a takana through Hefker Beis Mehefker that we're going to suspend the validity of a kinyan Mos until such time as Lokeach makes a kinyan, and we're talking about a Maisa kinyan Mashiach on Metaltalin Gzera Shemayoma Lo Nisrafu Chitecha Ba'aliyah. But let's just explain. Let's say Chalila V'chas, in a case where the mocher has the merchandise that he's selling, the Metaltalin, and it's located in a machsan, in some sort of a otzer, and now a fire breaks out. So what's the mocher's attitude? to what extent is he motivated to be matriach himself and call the fire department, whatever he has to do in order to put out the fire and save the merchandise? If he's already sold it and the Kenyan is clinched, then he'll say to himself psychologically, not that he's a bad guy, but he'll say, you know what? Why should I go all out, and spend who know what, tircha and calling the fire agency and so forth and so on? It's not my loss. The Kenyan was clinched. The mocher is going to suffer the loss. Let him find a way of getting a fire department here to put out the fire. So therefore, the Rabbanan were worried about nisrfu chitosecha be'aliyah, that maybe in the attic or the storehouse where the merchandise that was sold is kept, maybe a fire would break out. The Rabbanan said, you know what? The sale is not valid. If the sale is not valid because there was never a Mashiach, if there was a Mashiach, then the Lokech took it out of the Otzer and put it into his backyard. He'll deal with it if a fire breaks out. But if there was no Mashiach and he only put down money, then we're going to say to the Lokech, you know what? If in event a fire breaks out, it's the Mocher who's going to suffer the loss. The Kinyan is invalid. We're going to suspend the validity of the Kinyan until such time as you take the merchandise into your Rishus. As long as you leave it in the Rishus of the Mocher and all you did was pay money, then we're going to say it belongs to the Mocher. The Mocher will therefore get out of bed in the middle of the night, take off his pajamas and put on his clothes and get ahead and put out the fire. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Pegim. Yom echad ha'os ha'amur bi'osav bino. We have a rule in Zmanim, in Moadim, that Hayom holech achar alayla, meaning the 24-hour period of a day, a halachic day, begins with night and continues the next day. That principle will apply to Osav Espino. Therefore, if he shechts the mother animal at night, then if he goes ahead the following day after daybreak and shechts the offspring, he violates Osav Espino. Yom echad ha'omer bi'osav espino, hayom holech achar halayla. And at Zu, this halachic rule, Darash Reb Shimon ben Zoma, Reb Shimon ben Zoma felt he needed a pasuk in the Torah to establish that Hayom Holech Achar Alayla in Osov V'Espino. Nemar b'Maisa Brachis. It says Yom Echad in Maisa Brachis. V'nemar b'Osov V'Espino Yom Echad. The same that we have in Gzeir Shava is Ma Yom Echad Om Maisa Brachis Hayom Holech Achar Alayla. It says Vayerev Vayehi Voker. The night comes first and the daytime follows after the night. Is Af. So too Yom Echad Om b'Osov V'Espino Hayom Holech Achar Alayla. So Gemara says Tana Rabbanan Zu Darash Reb Shimon ben Zuta ben Zoma. Why did Reb Shimon ben Zoma need a pasuk for this? We know that in all of Moadim, in Kol HaTorah Kula, the halacha is, that's the rule, Hayom Holech Achar Alayla. Was there some sort of a havamina to say that no, it's Halayla Holech Achar Hayom in Osov Espino, L'fisha Kol HaInyan Kulo Eina Medaber El B'Kodshim. If you take a look in the pasuk of Osov V'Espino, where it says Shar Oseh Osov V'Espino Lo Sishk B'Yom Echad, and that's in Vayikra Chav Beis. If you look at the previous pasuk, the pasuk speaks in Vayikra Chav Beis about how old is the animal that just was born, in order to make it eligible for the Mizbeach in Kodshim. It's got to be on the 8th day. In any event, the whole context there of Osov Espino is Kodshim. And therefore, Kodshim, we have a principle. This is the only area in the Torah where the halacha is that Alayla Holech Achar Yom. Because the Torah says that lo So siru menu ad boker, which means that even though you shechted and brought the carbon by day, you eat the bus of the carbon the entire night, and if you leave it till the next morning, after daybreak, then you violate the sunosa. So we see that with regard to kachim, this is also called in zvachim hadam nifsal b'shkiyas achama. Anyway, it means that the night follows the day. Is Yochel Afzek, I would think that in regards to Osov Espino, which is written in the context of Kodshim, Nemer Khan, right, we would also apply the same principle that the night follows the day, which means that if he shechted the mother during the day, and then after nightfall he shechted the offspring, he would violate Osov Espino because the Lila is attached to the day, like it is in Kodshim. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma has to darshan Nemer kan yom echad v'nemer ma'aser beis yom echad ma yom echad ha'omer v'ma'aser beis hayom holech halayla af hayom yom echad ha'omer b'yosef espino hayom holech achar halayla. And now we're going to turn to Daf Pei Gimel and Beis, and we're going to complete Perek Osov Espino. Rebbe says, you know what? While you're already darshaning the Pasuk Yom Echad in the parsha of Osov Espino, I want to add another dimension, an additional halacha that we could derive from Yom Echad and Osov Espino. Mind you, Rebbe is not going to disagree with Rab Shimon ben Zoma, but he's adding. And he says the following: Yom HaMiyuchad Ton Karuz Mikadomru Barba Prokmashana Mochem Behemel Chaver Tzarech Lo Dia. The Yom Echad indicates a special day, right? So since the pasuk says Shar Oseh Lo Shishk Tu Yom Echad, also Vespino Lo Shishk Tu Yom Echad, Yom Echad means a special day. There are 4 special days during the year, and why did the Torah in the parsha of Osov Espino specify and give a high profile to these 4 days, Yom Echad? Because there's a chiyuv on the mocher to notify the lokech on these days, which is called ton cruz. Cruz means lo dio. He's got to notify the lokech that he already had sold the mother or the vlad on that day. Hadron olecha oso vespino, and now we begin the 6th parak of Chullin Be'ez Hashem, parak kisui hadam.